Episode 42, The Workflow Show. Today we go behind the scenes and I share my 10-step podcast workflow from start to finish. And you are listening to episode number 42 of Mike Murphy Unplugged. Learn, create, move forward. I am your host, Mike Murphy. I'm a one-man band, I'm a technology junkie, and I love helping people figure things out. And I am really excited to be here with you today. The goal of Mike Murphy Unplugged, it's to help you learn what you need to know in order to create online content so you can move forward in business and in life. And in this episode number 42, I pull back the curtains and share my workflow and the 10 steps-ish that I take to produce each episode of Mike Murphy Unplugged from start to finish. But first, as always, let's start the show with a question of the week from Ask Mike Anything. And for those of you just tuning into the show for the first time, Ask Mike Anything. It's your chance to ask me what you want to know more about. Where are you struggling in your online business? Head on over to mikemurphy.co. Leave me a question and I will answer it in a future episode. Today's Ask Mike Anything. What is a podcatcher? Hang around the podcast space long enough and you're going to hear this term quite a bit. A podcatcher is simply a web or mobile application used to manage and organize your podcasts and discover new shows. The most famous and popular podcatcher is iTunes, and on the iPhone or iPad, it's the Apple Podcast app, which is one of those sacred iPhone apps that you are not allowed to delete because it's so important. Podcatchers, they're aggregators. They're similar to like a newswire. Just picture that. Remember the RSS feed that I've talked about a few times? One of the first steps in launching your podcast is creating your podcast's unique RSS feed, okay? You submit the RSS feed to each directory that you want to be in, such as iTunes, Spreaker, Google Play, and TuneIn, etc. Fortunately, though, you don't have to submit your RSS feed to each podcatcher. Podcatchers talk to the directories directly and pull your RSS feed so subscribers to your show will always be updated whenever you publish a new episode. People who discover your show in a podcatcher can also subscribe there. So what podcatchers do I use? Well, I use two primarily, Apple's podcast app and Overcast. Overcast is very popular and I would say it's my favorite of the two. I really like its ability to create playlists, and its smart speed function is very handy for listening to podcasts greater than 2 times speed, which is what I typically do, so I can consume more in less time. Other popular iOS podcatchers are Castro, Pocket Casts, and Downcast. I hear a lot of good things about Pocket Casts, which is also a favorite on Android devices. I know very little about Android apps, but I do know that Pocket Casts is very popular there. So is Podcast Addict, Podcast Republic, and Player FM, all found on Android devices. And then, of course, there is Google Play for Android phones. So there you have it. All you need to know about podcatchers. They're really nothing more than an application on your phone or on your computer, such as iTunes, that uses the RSS feeds from podcasts around the world, makes them available to you to discover new and old podcasts, subscribe to podcasts that you want to listen to and enjoy. Think of podcatchers as podcast organizers and managers. Okay, let's jump into episode number 42, behind the scenes of my podcast workflow. This is my start to finish process of how I prepare and produce every episode of this podcast. I am very structured and routine-oriented, but I am also constantly looking for ways to streamline and make things faster and easier. I will not lie, maintaining a weekly podcast is a ton of work, so it is really important that I have systems in place that are repeatable and keep my workflow seamless. The number one cause for pod fading is burning out, and that is often caused by overwhelm of producing a show week after week. It's hard, which is why I wanted to share with you exactly what I do, and maybe it will generate some ideas to help you streamline your process or prepare you for what to expect if you're about to launch a podcast of your own. A lot of people ask me for advice on launching a podcast, and I really make it clear that producing a quality podcast takes time, commitment, dedication, and a lot of hard work. From episode 1 until now, episode 42, not a week goes by when I do not make some little tweak to make the process just a little bit better or a little more efficient. Podcasting is all about the long game, so it's critical you have a workflow in place and that you do whatever you can to create a system that you have control over and not the other way around. So let's go. Here's an overview of the big picture items that need to get done every single week for each episode. Podcast releases every Friday morning. Blog posts and show notes every Friday. Social media marketing ongoing, and newsletter arrives to your inbox every Friday morning at 6 a.m. These are the 4 components that have to get done every week. Let's start the workflow from the top, and I'm going to break down each step so you can see the workflow exactly. Fridays are podcast day. I work from home on Fridays, and it is a very productive day for me. By 5 p.m. on Friday afternoon, I am over 90% done with my podcast for the following week. New podcasts go live every Friday morning at 12:15 a.m. This step is scheduled in advance, so it's done while I'm sleeping. I use PowerPress plugin in WordPress to publish each week's episode at exactly 12:15 a.m. every Friday morning. As soon as my blog post gets published in WordPress, subscribers to my podcast will get the new episode automatically in their podcatcher. iTunes does have issues from time to time, but you can log into podcastconnect.com portal, the new portal, and refresh, which will fix it, or just be patient as iTunes will update eventually. The main thing is your listeners will always get your updates almost in real time, so always be sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss a future episode. Okay, step 1, the verification and start of the workflow. I usually get up at 4 a.m. on Fridays and just verify that everything is running smoothly, and because I'm at my most productive state from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., hands down. I subscribe to my own show, and I check on my iPhone to make sure that the new episode is live. Just as an FYI, once your podcast is live, you still can make changes if you find a typo, or you can even swap out the audio altogether if something really bad happens. So don't panic if you do discover an error, okay? Step 2, housekeeping, organization, and artwork. This step is easy, but it's important. This is the organization set up for my entire process. On my Mac, I create a podcast episode main folder where my artwork and audio files go. Anything related to the podcast episode goes in this folder. Then I create the episode artwork in Adobe InDesign, which is simply a matter of duplicating last week's artwork, changing the episode and title, and exporting it to the artwork folder in my main podcast folder. I use the same artwork for WordPress and in my newsletter. Then I go into my website and WordPress and use my Divi podcast template that I created and schedule the post to go out the next week at 12:15 a.m. I add the featured image artwork that I just created, I hit schedule, and I'm done. Then I go over to Mailchimp, which is what I use to make my newsletter. I duplicate last week's newsletter. I delete all the links and articles so that I have a clean slate. I add the new episode number, the title, the artwork that I just made, and I'm all set with Mailchimp in my newsletter for the following week. All I'm doing here is creating the empty framework for each new episode. So once the podcast is in its finished state, I just have to go back and fill in the gaps. It's all about streamlining and repetition. Step 3, social media marketing. This is a 2-step process on Friday mornings. Part 1, my weekly newsletter comes to your inbox every Friday morning at 6 a.m. Once I receive the newsletter, I check it over, then I head on over to today's post inside of WordPress, and I send out a social media post using Buffer to Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, letting people know that the new episode is out. Then, as many of you know, I create a photo, video, or something every single day on Instagram, 365 days a year. On Fridays, I keep it simple, but I do add text with this week's episode number and title, and in the Instagram post, I give a little bit more detailed description of what the show is about. Instagram is a social media site, so it is a great place to market your podcast. Okay, typically, everything up until this point, I'm done by 7 a.m. on Fridays. Now it's time for my favorite step. That's step 4, bike ride and walk time. No exceptions to this rule. I also take an exercise break in the late afternoon. Okay, are you with me so far? And just to recap, this is the Friday morning between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. I verify that the podcast went live and is in iTunes. Next is the housekeeping and framework organization for the following week's show. This includes creating episode artwork, scheduling show notes and blog posts, and newsletter template. Once the newsletter arrives in my email, I head to WordPress and share on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, with one click using Buffer. I do my daily upload to Instagram. I do my exercise, I have a smoothie, and then I'm on to step 5. This is where the heavy lifting comes in. Step 5 is the script writing process. This can take anywhere from 4 to 5 hours. I know, it sounds a lot, but it used to take a lot longer. Side tip here, I use the Pomodoro technique when writing my script that keeps me on track. Using an app on my iPhone, I work in very focused 25-minute intervals, and I get 5-minute breaks in between each interval. at which time I might check emails, social media, or stretch my back. Once the break timer goes off, I'm back to writing the script. I put my phone in airplane mode. I turn off all notifications on my Mac, which you can do FYI in the menu bar by option clicking on the 3 little lines in the upper right of your Mac. Little side tip there. Step 6 is another round of social media updates. The script is complete. I need some decompression time, so I use this time to update my social media channels. I'll send out another update using Buffer, and I will go and answer any type of correspondence on my social media channels. Step 7, recording and editing. This is a 1 to 2 hour time window. I record directly into Adobe Audition. I don't stop recording until I am finished. If I make a mistake or a plane flies overhead or the landscapes are making noise outside, I fix it. When I'm done recording, the editing is minimal. Another bonus tip, I always eat green apples before I record because I read somewhere that it helps your voice, and I like apples, so this has become my little tradition, and I always keep a thing of water close by. I turn off AC and any other noises that might come into the recording, and I get into a game face mindset here. I stretch a little bit, I smile, I try to get in a happy mood before I record. Do what works for you, but never record in a bad mood, and always try to stay positive and smile while you're speaking. Step 7.5, the editing. I listen and edit at the same time and work my way from start to finish, cleaning up the gaps in the recording, and if I think there's something I said isn't needed, I chop it out. I then do quick processing, the noise reduction, normalization, little EQ, compression, and all that. I send it to multi-track. I have a template already done with my intro and outro music. I export it as the final MP3. I match it to the loudness of broadcast standards of -19 LUFS since I work in mono. Step number 8 is tagging and uploading to Libsyn. This is very fast, 10 minutes. The tagging is the ID3 digital metadata that we've talked about in the past. This is how you bake in the title, description, author name, show notes, and whatnot to your podcast episode. Once the tagging is done, I upload it to Libsyn. Libsyn will provide me with the URL that I'll paste into PowerPress inside of WordPress, and then I'm pretty much done and ready to go on to step 9. In step 9 is the show notes and scheduling the final post in WordPress. I make my show notes very easy. I take the script, I chop it up inside Scrivener. I use a program called Byword that allows me to use what's called multi-markdown language. That just makes it ready to format for WordPress. Once I'm done organizing my show notes, I copy it, I paste it inside of WordPress, I schedule the post for the following week at 12:15 a.m., and I am done on Friday. Step 9 is the last step on my Friday routine. All that's left on Fridays is to do my afternoon exercises and give myself a happy hour reward for a job well done. Step 10 is pretty much a week-long process. That's the newsletter and topic curation. My weekly newsletter, officially titled Mike's Mixtape, FYI, is a labor of love. I spend all week curating content. I try to fill it in with things that interest me and things that I think are relevant to the podcast and content creation space. So as I discover an article or an inspiring piece of content, I head on over to Mailchimp and I paste it into the newsletter, and I build up the newsletter over time. I seal up the newsletter on Thursday afternoons by scheduling it to send the following morning at 6 a.m. The curation process continues with Ask Mike Anything. I gather questions all week from email, social media, typically on Blab is where I get most of the questions that I will use, not only for the Ask Mike Anything, but sometimes for the topic of the entire show. So, there you have it. That's the 10-ish step workflow of Mike Murphy Unplugged. That's all it takes to make one episode of Mike Murphy Unplugged. Not bad, right? Then, rinse and repeat. Quick recap of the 10-step workflow. Number 1, verify that the new episode is alive and well in iTunes and podcatchers around the world. Number 2, organize and set up the framework and artwork for the following episode. Number 3, social media marketing. I use Buffer to send out to Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, and I create an Instagram post with the current episode designed and the photo with the description in the post. Number 4, exercise and breakfast. Yes, this is part of the workflow. Number 5, script writing. The hardest part of the process, but kind of important. Number 6, social media maintenance and correspondence. Step number 7, recording and editing. Step number 8, tagging and uploading to Libsyn. Step 9 is the show notes and WordPress scheduling for the following week. And step number 10, newsletter and Ask Mike Anything curation. This is the all-week process. I hope today gave you some insight on my process, but more importantly, what you might expect if you're considering starting a podcast for yourself. My podcast workflow is going to be different than yours, but there are a lot of pieces in the podcast puzzle, and the more organized and streamlined you are, the easier it gets to reproduce week after week. Every week it gets faster and easier for me, and it's all because I have a system in place and I'm getting better and more efficient on all of the steps, and that comes with practice, time, and experience. All good things in all good time. And as always, I thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this podcast. I really do appreciate it. And now that you know my workflow just a little bit better, be sure to keep those questions and future topics coming in so that my curation process gets even better. Send me an email or a social media shout out if there's anything you want me to talk more about or to just say hey. Also, if you haven't done so already, be sure to sign up for Mike's Mixtape newsletter over at mikemurphy.co so you never miss the latest curated news and updates. And I thank you for joining me today. I hope you join my one-man band, and together we can learn, create, and move forward. Cheers.